Hey everyone, and welcome to my A-level art sketchbook tour. So the theme we were given was messages, and from this I created a mind map to explore the different ways one can interpret that theme. And ultimately I ended up going down the environmental route, more specifically environmental problems such as waste and littering. So I started off by doing a couple of drawings. Here I did an observational drawing using colouring pencils of like a trolley full of trash. I literally remember coming back from school and just taking pictures of all the trash I found on my way back home. And I like some elements of the drawing, but I feel like the blending could have been a lot more smoother with the colouring pencils. Then I completed a graphite drawing on A2 paper of payphone. I also used white paint for the highlights and the whiter areas of the photos. I'm not quite sure why I decided to sketch a payphone, but I suppose at the beginning I wasn't entirely sure as to what direction I would take the theme. The first artist I looked at was Robert Bradford, and he turned old toys and other waste material into art. His work was so detailed, so I did some biro sketches and labelled what I saw within his sculpture for inspiration for my artist response later on. So this is my response. It did not turn out the way I expected it to, but I'm really glad I gave it a go. So I created a sculpture of my brother using a cereal box, some plastic wrapper thing, and some other foil thing. I don't really know what that is, and that's that. Then I moved on to exploring my ideas further by carrying out a range of observational pieces using different types of media like oil pastels, charcoal, rubbing gum and acrylic paint. The next artist I looked at was Tom Fanasteel, and he's a hyper-realistic sculptor and painter. So here I did some analysis of his work and I drew some of his sculptures as well. For this I used biro, and for the others I used colouring pencils and sketch pencils. Here's my study, which I did using colouring pencils. And then for my response, I was inspired by one of his works of a crumpled up diary entry. So I decided to draw one myself. This is of my little brother's diary entry that he had to complete as part of his schoolwork, and he let me rip it and crumple it and eventually sketch it. At this point, I decided to express the issue of consumerism in my own work, so I completed a couple of developments to try and express the idea. First development, I used acrylic paint and colouring pencils. For the second one, I just used colouring pencils. And then for the third one, I used colouring pencils again, and then for the fourth, I used biro. For my final design, I decided to do a colouring pencil drawing of a squashed Coca-Cola can. This drawing here was a rough idea, so the quality isn't great, but I essentially wrote down what my message was and why I chose to present it this way. And here's my final piece. Looks-wise, I was really pleased with the proportions and the colouring. I tried my best to make it as similar to the picture I had taken, but there was one main problem. My message was just not clear. The specific feedback I received, which is also written in bright red in the background of my evaluation, was that this piece was just an observational drawing, and I can't argue with that. So to try and find new ways to deliver my message, I visited Chisenhall Gallery for artist HUUUGE's Wasted Mud exhibition, and I completed some mini biro sketches of her work. I wasn't exactly sure of my next steps, so I completed a couple of observational drawings. Here is a biro sketch I did exploring a sort of scribbling mark making technique, which turned out quite nice. I also used colouring pencils to draw a part of a Maltesers packet, and if you can hear my brother shouting in the background, I'm so sorry. was mainly doing observational pieces of like close-ups of wrappers and crumpled boxes. So here I did one in sketch pencils and the other I did with watercolour. I then went on to use sketch pencils on sugar paper, and I used white pen for the highlights / the lighter parts. And then for the other one, I used watercolour and acrylic paint. I mainly used acrylic paint for the darker areas since it is more opaque. The next artist I looked at was Bob and Roberta Smith, because I thought it might be a good idea to add an element of typography to clarify my message. And then for my study, I used acrylic paint for the letters, and then I used sketch pencils and a white pen for the door. This study actually turned out quite nice. It looks really similar to the original. And then I went on to create a response which combined my message and Bob and Roberta Smith's style, and I did this using acrylic paint on cardboard. Okay, so this is one of my favourite spreads of this book because it was fun to make and interesting to look at. Essentially, I was exploring with composition using Photoshop to edit pictures and add text, but yeah, it looks really cool. And here I was using different colours to see which would suit my idea. I also did a little thing on colour theory, since my artist used a lot of colour in his work, so I wanted to see if I could incorporate that in my own. So I did a couple of experiments outside of my book, which I forgot to add, hence the awkward positioning of it later on in my book. But essentially I did a surfaces experiment. I painted / drew on different materials like tracing paper, mod rock, tissue paper and newspaper. I explored a bit more with mod rock since it was my first time using it, and here's a little montage of all of the experiments I did outside of my book. I really liked how the acrylic paint and biro looked on cardboard. So I did a sustained idea where I chose one of the smaller experiments I did and painted / sketched it on a larger piece of cardboard. My idea had definitely made progress from before, but I just felt like I could add more colour, otherwise it's not going to grab the viewer's attention the way I intended it to. So I completed a couple of more developments where I tried out different colour combinations and typography to see which one was the most striking whilst being easy to read. So during the summer holidays from year 12 to 13, we were given the task to do I think it was A2 observational drawing, and oh my gosh. This took so much time, but it turned out so good. Like, there's so much detail. This camera did not give it justice. I'm telling you, it looks way better in... Anyways, I had to cut myself off because I was waffling too much. But this is a piece I did using sketch pencils of a can deteriorating over time. Moving on to my final design, I used Photoshop to create this sort of black and white image of the crumpled wrapper, and I documented my process here. I then went on to paint a couple of different colour combinations for the writing in the back, which reads, "You do not need it," to address excessive consumerism. And here's my outcome that I completed using acrylic paint for the text and biro for the drawing. I used an old and torn piece of cardboard to do this on. And I was concerned my colour combination would resemble traffic lights, but it doesn't resemble it too much, so I was pleased with that. And here's a little close-up of the mark making I did, which turned out pretty cool. I did an evaluation spread just to reflect on my thoughts of the outcome and figure out my next steps with this idea. I wanted to delve further into mixed media. So I looked at Polly Jones, who is a mixed media artist, and I completed a study of her work using acrylic paint and stuck various pieces of wrappers, old newspapers and magazines in the background and roughly painted over them. I really didn't like how my response turned out, but it's essentially supposed to be onion peels in a china plate. So I discovered Lally Mill on YouTube, and she makes these beautiful mixed media pieces. So I thought I'd make a spread on her virtual exhibition Ankara to sort of explore how she uses mixed media to elevate her work. Here I brainstormed different ideas using all of the data I collected so far, and in this plastic wallet I included some composition experiments I completed. At this point I was looking more into the idea of food waste, hence the depictions of banana and apple peels. Looking back, this was definitely not my best pieces of work. The apple turned out alright, but the longer you look at it, you realise it's not proportional and it just looks rushed. But I had a couple of new ideas I wanted to try out, and I completed both of these using acrylic paint. I took a couple of photos of a plastic bag full of trash and presented it using different combinations of media and materials like watercolour, colouring pencils, and I even used a plastic bag. I photoshopped a couple of orange peels to look like it had mould. I know the photoshopping doesn't look great, but I knew I could tweak it a bit when painting. So at this point I was looking into composting in addition to food waste. And this brings me to the end of book 1. I thought it would be easier to film my sketchbook in 2 parts, so you can go straight on to the next part, or you can take a break, grab a coffee, tea or a snack and return for part 2. Thank you for watching, bye!